right, here we go with our next episode of the Journey in Recovery series on the Reco12 podcast. This will be episode number 143. We'll be discussing step 11 with Matt D, and I'm really excited about this. By the way, I'm Justin. I am a son of God and a recovering addict, and I am grateful to be the host of the Reco12 podcast. And back in 2017 through 2020, I was also the host of a podcast called Journey Through Life, in which I just interviewed ordinary people with extraordinary stories and had long-form interviews with them and great conversations, meaningful conversations with all sorts of people. And towards the end of 2019, my higher power was just nudging me and saying, Justin, you got to do a series on the 12 steps of recovery and get to know more about recovery. I was pretty insulated and isolated in my own little world of recovery at that point, thinking that I had it figured out and that my little circle was sufficient to keep me sober and working God's program. Well, in this process, man, did my eyes open up to a whole new world. And it was the wellspring, it was the inspiration of the Reco12 podcast, where we talk to recovering addicts from any faith background, anywhere in the world, any addiction, and talk about and hear about the similarities of addiction and the similarities of recovery and what it takes, and what a beautiful concept that is to me. Anyways, as mentioned before, in this episode, we will be talking with Matt D, who really opened my eyes to a lot of things in this conversation. He's not the person that introduced me to two-way prayer. That was Father Bill W., but he is somebody who described how he does it, and I added a lot of those things into my own practice of two-way prayer in my Step 11 practice, and it's a really cool conversation. So we'll be talking with Matt D about Step 11, and it's pretty interesting to me that many of the new ideas and practices that I have learned about and that I am putting into place in my own life have to do primarily with Step 11. And this is another powerful conversation with some really good insights into conscious contact with God, which is what Step 11 is all about, improving my conscious contact with God. And man, it's a game changer. Two-way prayer, conscious contact is my daily bread. It's my manna in the wilderness. And without it, I would very quickly get lost in my own self, doing things my own way. And as 38 years of my life proved, doing things my own way really got me in quite of a mess. Anyways, now let's do a little bit of business before jumping in with this conversation with Matt D. If you enjoy Reco12, please rate and review us. It's a great way to work your Step 12 and help us continue working our Step 12 by getting this message out to more people. If you are listening to any episode, this one included, and you're like, holy cow, this is really good, and God is nudging you to share it with an individual, share it with them. Share this with your recovery network if you find value in Reco12. We really appreciate that. And if you feel so nudged, donate. Donate to Reco12. It helps us work our 12th step by paying for the overhead of the podcast platform, the web hosting, and all of that fun stuff that goes along with it. You can donate at the links in the show notes of this meeting. And starting January 6th, if you want to get back in on the live meetings on Zoom, they happen every Friday at noon Central Time. We have a different speaker, and the live audience is able to ask questions and get those answered. So anyways, let's get started here. Look forward to hearing from Matt D, and here we go. So I'm sitting here today with Matt D through the magic of the internet. It's really cool to be able to talk to you from across the country. Matt, tell us a little bit about yourself. Introduce yourself as if you would in a 12-step meeting, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. That's great. So I'm Matt. I'm a recovered addict. So my recovery goes back, I guess first I should say I'm a member of All Addicts Anonymous. It's a small fellowship. It's been around for a number of years, primarily centralized actually in the county that I live in now. The guy who founded it was an early member of Alcoholics Anonymous, was very active working directly with Bill Wilson on the writing of the 12 and 12 and editing the big book and AA
Wow.
Comes of Age. Very influential, but of course anonymous, as we all are. I got my recovery started about 20 years ago. I actually had connected with him and a group of recovered addicts that were around him. I had already, prior to that, was trying to get sober in AA with no success. And this is a thing that doesn't use it. It often happens that people come into a fellowship for a substance addiction and then over time realize they have a problem with a non-substance addiction, like sex, for instance, or, whatever. Maybe you come in and it's booze and then later it's food. For me, it became very clear that if I didn't deal with the sex hang-up, I would never get right with the booze and drugs. It just was very obvious to me for a number of reasons. One is this old saying, that cleanliness is next to godliness. And I could see if I was going to get sober, I had to be serious about God, and I couldn't get serious unless I was clean. And that meant my conduct, my behavior, my thoughts, my actions. And so for me, I saw that the booze thing was, if I was going to deal with it, I had to really take this whole thing on. Anyway, the steps, not to go in the weeds, but the steps themselves are requiring such a thing anyway. When you look at it, it says, turn your will and your life. I mean, it's everything,
right.
All these defects of character and all of our affairs. So it's really calling for, the prescription is for the whole thing, not compartmentalized. But for me, I really had to go in for the whole thing.
So I think that's really interesting. And the name of the fellowship, All Addicts Anonymous or All Addictions Anonymous?
All Addicts.
All Addicts Anonymous. So you work with people from every addiction possible,
Right. Behind the substance, you can have all kinds of depression, anxiety, hang-ups with resentment, with lying, there's so many things that essentially it's a very basic understanding of what the word addiction is, which is it's basically a habit a person can't break.
Yeah. So tell me what your first experience in your addictive behaviors, at least the one you remember or whatever, that may have launched into the addiction, and then kind of go along in that story to where rock bottom was, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. I should say that as an adjunct, and maybe also to add to to pick up your question, hopefully I can pull this off, is this other aspect, which was that the reason that booze had become so important to me at a certain point was it was an actual relief from the guilt and shame and fear of the things that I had been doing. And that in essence was what my life was like going back to when I was a little kid. There were things that I had done and were doing, and particularly it was in the sex department, that I was ashamed of. And I think that road for me was a short one. I got in the program when I was I think I was 23 years old.
Okay.
I've been in for 20 years now. But I think that although the booze and the drugs definitely sped up this point of a crisis, that behind it all along, I was really trying to damper down all of the effects of my behavior. And again, particularly with the sex. So I would say that my primary addiction is alcohol, but I would say that my killing addiction is sex. And that started out, the sex hang up for me started out as far back as I can almost remember. As a young kid, I used to try to encourage any kind of fantasy and things related to sex. And by the end, which was when I was around, again, I was a young man, about 22, 23 years old. By the end, I became in complete horror of the thoughts that might actually enter my mind, because I didn't know if I would actually carry them out. And I had no idea what they might mean, what I might do.
Hmm.
So for something that for years I tried to protect and keep close and keep in the shadows, of course, so it didn't leak out to where I would have to change my behavior. Something I protected, by the end, I became in complete horror and fear of it. So I would say, I guess it was around 1999, that year, I had the thing itself, the situation itself was one of being in a kind of psychic anguish and pain. I was going about my business. I was doing, a regular job and stuff, but life, I wasn't into a thing of suicide at that point, but I was just totally coming apart, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. And I had been squeezed, hard enough, and fortunately painted somewhat into a corner where there's this thing where it's like, if you're going to go, it's inevitable, it's inescapable. Like if you're going to go forward, something has to die. And it's like either it's going to be yourself or it's going to be your old way of living. And essentially that was what happened to me.
And what was that kind of wake up call at that age? But what kind of facilitated that? I've got to change. Something's got to die here.
There were basic external things that were happening at the time that they weren't in themselves very impactful to me. But I feel like a lot of this is what was going on behind the scenes. I couldn't go anywhere like a free man. Everywhere I went, I was looking around. I was always consumed or obsessed with the idea of sex and fantasy and lust. I had lived so much in a false world that I couldn't function very well in the real world. Again, I was doing my best, and I was working and stuff, but I was out of my mind.
One thing that I justified in my own life, and I have heard so many other people justify, is you're just a guy. That's what all guys do. What's your now? What is your experience with that, and what is your understanding with that? You're just a guy, and all guys, are obsessed with sex in one way or another.
Well, I think the thing about that is that sex is a sacred act. All sacred acts, if you violate them or twist them for your own selfish use or abuse them, there is a high penalty. And the penalty is your sanity. And that's what happened to me. I went totally out of my mind. If it was a booze problem, which there was a booze problem, but if my central main killing addiction was a booze problem, I could substantiate these things by saying, I had been into rehabs and smashed up cars and done this and done that. And I have my fair share of those things that I could say. And I could give some details about the sex thing, but mostly it's somewhat of like an inward, psychic suffering that comes, and an insanity, just being completely out of your mind. And it's hard to substantiate a sex addiction problem in the same terms as people understand addiction. But let me tell you, the suffering is in many regards worse. I think that's why I had this kind of dual addiction thing going, where I needed the booze as a crutch, I'd say, to deal with the sex thing.
So as you came to that realization, as you mentioned earlier, that something had to die, either myself or my old self, my old way of being, how did you decide that going into I'm assuming a 12-step meeting at that point, or some sort of program therapy? How did you decide to start doing that?
So at the time, I was actually living in Ohio, not very far. It was actually a lot of the early groups out there. There were some old timers going to meetings with people who went to meetings with, like Dr. Bob and the early AA members and stuff. And that was a kind of a neat experience.
Yeah. So what made you decide to start attending a 12-step group at that point when you had to make the decision, something's got to change here?
Yeah, I'd say that what preceded this experience was I had gone to, as a kid, I was in so much trouble. I had actually been removed from my home.
Oh.
That's a nice way of saying I'd been kicked out. I ended up in a private boarding school in upstate New York. Sounds a lot nicer than it was. It was more like a 12-step boot camp. And you did what they said. And a lot of times if you did something that was out of line, all of your, again, this is like a boot camp. They literally would put you up in front of everybody and they would take your inventory for you.
Oh.
They'd give you an opportunity to take it for yourself too, if you weren't too sore or stunned to just stand there, but it was part of the process was there was inventory work and there was prayer and there was devotion and there was all kinds of stuff that was waking me up in certain ways. But I hadn't fundamentally at the place of where your will is turning it over to God. I hadn't really made that decision. I had received a lot of the benefits from activities that are 12-step activities, but I hadn't really made a decision. So I had experience of the 12 steps, knew about them, been to meetings and all of that prior to all of this, which, if it does anything, it makes the deviation from the 12-step way of life, makes you even more aware of it.
All right. You had gone through these boot camps, you've gone through basically 12-step programs before, but it didn't take. Why do you think that the whole turning your life and your will over to the care of God didn't take at that time?
I would say it's because it's the least cheap possible thing that can happen to a human person. What it takes to actually get to the point where you would turn your will and life over. In most cases, it usually involves, near death. I've heard it explained like in the Army, you go in and you do what they tell you to do. Like you literally are completely under somebody else's care. There isn't a little bit of yourself that's left. To get to that point, you literally need the hell beaten out of you, or almost being at the point of complete death, or some kind of a psychic state of death where you're, so out of your mind, you're coming apart. To have that happen for somebody that is still, I went through those experiences as a teenager, and a teenager's ability to conceive of things like death are they're never farther than when you're about 15 or 16 years old. I mean, this is why kids ride their bicycles off roofs and do all kinds of crazy stuff. It's just never going to happen to them, or the ego thing is never more in well-functioning order than when you're in your late teens, and God seems almost never further away. Fortunately, I think one of the things that played in my case is I was somewhat of a spoiled brat, and I think that when I finally was on my own, which is in my early 20s, when I was suffering, when things were difficult, I had nobody else to blame, and I wasn't living at mommy and daddy weren't, I wasn't in their house anymore. I was on my own. If I didn't get my crap together, it was going to affect me and nobody else. Nobody else is going to clean up my messes for me. And I think that all these things came down at the point where it pressed in on me this opening that would allow for the idea of turning my will and life over to God. Also, the other thing is that when we turn our will and our life over to God, this is my opinion, your will is this weak thing. It isn't this shiny, beautiful, Cadillac. This thing is half broken, lets you down, deceives you all the time. And your life, at that point, I mean, what you're handing over is, prior to that, I thought, my will and my life were of the highest regard. It took a lot of beatings from life to get to the truth, to really see things about myself. And when you do that, it becomes, it's almost by reflex that you want to turn your will and life over to God, because you're like, holy cow, I'm going to continue to ruin it on my own.
In my own experience, and in so many others' experience that I've heard, our will, and I'm going to combine this with the phrase willpower, even though it's slightly different, but it's kind of this, it comes from the same place. I, as well as many people, have tried to conquer whatever weakness it is, whatever addiction, whatever it is, with willpower. Sick 'em, Will, go get it. I can do anything that I set my mind to, that whole pride, the whole ego thing of, I got myself in this mess, I have to get myself out of it. Did you battle those same type of emotions and actions, actually?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's this thing of, I look at it like this. It's like my whole life, ever since I was a little kid. There's a story I like to tell sometimes. There was an event. I was, I don't know how old I was, probably 5 years old or something. I remember being in a store. We were on vacation, and there was a raft that I wanted for this. We were at the beach, and there's a particular one I wanted. I think this was between my mother and myself, but I was pushing for this particular raft, and she started to say, we can't get that one, it's too expensive, but we can get you this one over here. And I remember, weeping, crying, doing the whole number. Mm-hmm. And she said, all right, we won't get you that one, but we'll get you this one, which was a little bit nicer, but not like the one that I was trying to, hoping to get. I did the whole routine all over again. And she said, okay, fine, we'll get you this one that you wanted. And at that moment, I realized there was an actual nicer one than that. I tried my hand again. Mm-hmm. She said, well, fine, and grabbed my arm and ripped me out of the store. And I remember being in the back seat. This is back before, seatbelts were a big thing and all that. But being in the back of this vehicle and just watching the store getting smaller and smaller as we're driving away. And I remember thinking to myself very clearly, I can never let that happen again. Like, I got to learn how to play my cards better. I got to really learn how to get the things that I want and not overplay my hand. My whole life, I started to develop this thing of learning how to not get caught in lies, how to get the things that I want, how to get people to like me. It's all these things became somewhat of my personality. It was the surface person. And I had my own drive, my own desires, my own, really, it's what the program talks about, the selfish self-centeredness, mm-hmm. being the real root of the problem. That stuff is something that's developed over time, and you work on. I worked on with all my might. That's another reason why you don't want to give it over, because you spent your whole life trying to develop it to be of greatest efficiency. And that's how I tried to live. And I relied on my own personality to get me through jams, to get me through anything that was difficult. If I had a class, school, assignments that were difficult, well, I would just act like a clown or I would figure some way to get through life based on my own so-called egotistical skills. And the the end of the story is that is no way to live. It doesn't get you what you ultimately want, which you don't find out until you learn to surrender your will in life.
So what does that mean, to surrender your will in life? What does that mean to you?
I think it means two things, essentially. I think it means an event, like literally an event, which I had. And I had this in Ohio when I first was getting onto the program. What happened to me was I had connected with All Addicts Anonymous, with AAA. I talked to some of the guys about the sex hang-up I had. One guy at that point had a sex recovery for almost 30 years. Early sex recovery precedes SA by like 10 years, because some of these SA Sexaholic Anonymous type recoveries were happening in AAA back in the 60s. And there was another guy at about 10 years who ended up becoming my sponsor. Anyway, I connected with them. I talked to them about what my main hang up was. They had, they said that a sex recovery was possible, that sanity in this department was possible. I didn't believe it. Mm-hmm. And they said, to use prayer. This is the topic of today's thing, but to use the 11th step, particularly repetitive prayer, in a time of temptation.
Hmm.
The big book makes reference to, saying many times, "Thy will, not mine, be done," or it says, "Don't be shy on the subject of prayer." There are people who are using it continuously. This is the idea. Was they said, when you're in temptation, just keep calling on God's name until the temptation goes away. They also said, if you're going to have a slip, if you're going to look at pornography or masturbate or whatever, before you do, just make a commitment that you'll call before you do it. And I made that commitment. They said, call once a week. So I made that commitment. And I was a little concerned because my whole life, I had never not given into temptation. I had no idea what the hell that was going to be like. And so it was like a week later, after visiting these people in upstate New York from AAA, and I came back. I'm in Ohio. I had been okay, and then, but I could feel like all, if I can speak for all sex addicts out there, there's this. You almost feel like a pressure building or a cloud of some kind of temptation, and it's like inescapable. You're not going to just wish it away. It's building and building, and here I was. I came home from work. I'm walking through the hallway. You parked in the back. You go through a hallway to get to the stairs where it led to my apartment, and there was a shared washer and dryer that was in the hallway. This is a pretty simple story that just, it's not very glamorous at all. And with stories of surrender, I've read some beautiful surrender stories, but here I am, I'm walking in, and the thought comes in my mind to look inside the washing machine. And the next thought was, well, maybe the gal that lives upstairs might have her things in there. And then the thought came, well, you can't live your whole life where you don't open up washing machines because you're afraid of temptations. And then the next thought was, well, but I don't even need to do my laundry. And then there I was. I sat in that hallway for 45 minutes, intermittently arguing and talking with myself, or who knows what. When you're talking to temptations, you have no idea what you may be talking to on the other end of that thing. In the meantime, though, I had remembered what they said about trying to pray repetitively. So intermittently, in between these discussions, I would pray. I happened to be a Christian, so I was saying the form of prayer I was saying was Jesus prayer, which is, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. And so I'm saying it over and over and over again, and then the arguments start to come back in, and I drop the prayer. And finally, after about 45 minutes of standing in this hallway, not moving, I finally took that first step towards my apartment, and I actually made it through. That was my first temptation that I did not give into. And it was because I kept calling on God's name for help. Just like if someone was to fall through the ice and they knew someone was nearby, they would call on their name for their lives, And even though it was intermittent and somewhat half-hearted at times, it was enough to get me through that temptation. And essentially what that did for me was it allowed me to realize that, first of all, the immense and absolute power of temptation, which is, it would be crushing in the frightening department if it weren't for the fact that I didn't find out the prayer was more powerful than that was. And I came through that with an experience of surrender. So surrender happens in an experience, in an event. What that did for me too is like being given a gift. I mean, who in their right mind would want to give up a gift of that magnitude? I mean, I could never in my life not, do that on my own. It could never be possible. And now this is this thing given to me, and I didn't want to lose it. So I would say that was an actual event and an experience of surrender. Then I would also say that surrender is something that is, Thibault, this is early, psychiatrist that was helpful with the formulation of AA. He used to say that it was a disciplinary experience. It's something that you try to do on a regular basis. I wake up in the morning and I say a third step prayer. And then my intention is to try to live that way, right? This often elicits these events. It isn't necessarily the event in itself. I think to have a surrender, you almost always it has to almost always be done in the teeth of adversity. Like, I think a lot of people come in and they're like, oh, I'll turn my one life over to God. And then all of a sudden this major temptation comes along. That's when you find out where the hell you are in relationship to the third step. You don't know until then.
I like how you put it that way. A real surrender, a real turning of one's life and will over to God happens in the teeth of adversity. We can say it all we want in smooth waters or whatever it may be, but when those waters are boiling and there seems to be no hope, like you mentioned, you're standing there in the hall for 45 minutes and the cloud is there and it's not going away. That surrender and being able to walk out of that is where the power comes from. The reality of it comes from. So is there anything else in your personal story that you feel is appropriate or necessary to share right now before we jump into what we're going to be talking about a little bit in step 11?
I don't know how important it is in the way of giving more detail to what we've already said. I was out of my mind with sex in all forms, including, fornication and masturbation and pornography. Mm-hmm. And mostly I was dealing with it. By then it had been with drinking, to try to deal with life and to deal with my actions. There was an event, I would say definitely as a young person, where I realized I was over my head for sure. And I had the opportunity, I was probably like 10 or 11 years old, I had the opportunity to unburden myself. At that time, I grew up my mother's Catholic, and I grew up in a setting where I had been brought mostly by duress to the confessional, which I, quote unquote, had to do or needed to do. And I didn't come up for it. I didn't admit the things that I had done. And I don't think it was any mistake that shortly thereafter, I got totally screwed up with drugs and with booze. Mostly talking about the sex thing, but the drugs, there was a period of my life where literally I had forgotten an entire month of my life, from taking certain drugs during high school.
And you had this kind of come on when you were 10 or 11, when, the drugs and alcohol kind of came on and got really into your life?
I started to get into drugs. I would say I was probably 13 or so. By the time I was 15 years old, I was totally screwed up. I was high all the time. I was just totally screwed up.
Very self-destructive behaviors of from all different angles, right?
I think there's this thing I've heard this, and I believe it is there's an initiatic age for persons in all cultures. There's the bar mitzvah, and there's confirmation. There's even American Indians. There's this whole thing that basically by the time you're about 12 years old, that if you don't have a spiritual experience of some kind, you're destined, or you're hungry as a human person for this kind of experience. And our culture and our day and age, it's like people are the idea of such things are so foreign. Maybe even people are hostile to the idea, to come up through that without having that kind of experience. You recreate it. You look for your own, get it. Everybody's, I don't want to say everybody, but a majority of persons are thirsty and hungry for it.
And so we as people then, if we don't have that spiritual awakening experience, initiation into something greater than ourselves, we then seek it in
Yeah.
something that we assume is greater than ourselves, whether it be drugs or booze or sex or whatever it may be. Well, very good. So let's, unless there's anything else you want to hit on there in your own experience and lessons learned, let's kind of move into step 11. Tell me, well, first, tell me what is step 11? How does it read? And then tell me a little bit about why it's important to you and your experience in working your step 11.
So the step itself reads, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. Yeah, so I had been just, in thinking about this podcast earlier, just jotted down some notes and stuff just to try to gather some things together. So one of the things as I've been doing so far is jumping around a lot. So thanks for trying to keep me focused.
Hey, we're good.
That's an issue, not just in conversation, but also in conversation with God. And talk about prayer time. There's
Me
that.
too.
Just in thinking about the step and what it means, the first aspect of it is seeking. I don't, as we've kind of talked about already, I think the whole idea of doing things like turning your will and life over to God, or to even seek out something like conscious contact, is a very, not just foreign, but difficult thing for anyone unless they've had these experiences. So the idea of the 11th step in itself is not without the grounds of all that happens to a person till they get to this point.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about it, I mean, essentially, this is the sole action of God that was the sunburst that gave birth to this whole fellowship movement.
Mm-hmm.
Here is this broken down businessman who goes, is completely at the point of a wet brain or being in an asylum for the rest of his life, who tried by every means possible, and this is not an unintelligent person or a person without a lot of will, tried everything he possibly could to deal with his own alcohol problem, and came to complete and total, desperation before he had an experience in Towns Hospital that didn't just revolutionize his life and stop, and produce the experience of sobriety, but it did the same for millions of people, and all these fellowships and everything is an outgrowth of that actual experience. So I would say in light of all the 12 steps, this thing of conscious contact is at the very heart of it.
Mm.
It's the very thing that gave birth to the experience that caused him to have sobriety. And all these movements, everything is coming off of conscious contact. It's an amazing thing.
Mm. So many great movements, pretty much a lot of things came from somebody questioning and saying, God, if there is a God, what do I need to do here?
Yeah.
Show me, give me greater light and understanding,
Yeah. And the beginning of that spiritual experience is actually desolation. I mean, it is to be desperate. That's the beginning of it, and you don't think about it, but that's a big, we call it hitting bottom, or they used to call it ego deflation at depth, but to actually get to the point where you as an ego are completely and thoroughly deflated. That's not a good feeling necessarily, but it's the doorway in which a experience of conscious contact occurs. If your ego is completely intact and this kind of thing, you're barred from this kind of an experience.
Yeah. So what does your prayer and meditation look like on a daily basis? How does that, do you have a routine or is it more ongoing? Tell me about that.
Yeah. So as we stated already, I would say that I'm not any golden exemplar or something of the practice of the 11th step. It's definitely something I do every day and have done every day of my life since I got into the program. There's many different things I've done over the years. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. It's good to switch things up from time to time. And then there's other aspects of it that I think it's like brushing your teeth or something. It's like something that you want to do every day, the same way, same time, same place, if you possibly can. Some of the things that I've done over the years, again, I've learned almost all of this from the AAA group that I got started in, and from its founder, who he was very active in prayer time and working with conscious contact his whole life, and teaching others how to do it. That was his whole life. That's another important thing, that conscious contact, the means in which you are to receive such an experience, you want to make sure that they're valid. If you're to try to do it through some means that are not legit, you can do yourself a lot of harm. And again, that brings us back to our addictions. I mean, that's the idea of what sex, food, booze, drugs, all these things in themselves are actual instruments for receiving conscious contact with God. There's spiritual awakening that's there. It's just they're completely invalid. I don't want to say they're invalid. I mean to say that they're cheats,
like counterfeits or something.
Yeah. Well, there's this scripture reference to getting into the sheepfold, the pasture. There's a doorway. If you jump the fence, you're a thief. And addicts in this regard are thieves. And that's what I was doing forever. I was stealing these experiences, of ecstasies, of ecstatic experience. I was stealing them. They were legitimate experiences, but they were done through means that were very dangerous, cheats. I was going to say something too about this idea about Bill Wilson and his experience, that one of the things that they had found out through his experience was that it was spiritual awakening and conscious contact which produced sobriety. From there forward, they were not solely interested in sobriety, which is total common sense. Like, hey, let's put sobriety forward. They didn't. They put conscious contact forward. They put that as the heart of their program, as the actual aim of the program itself. And sobriety was just a byproduct. It's an interesting thing.
It is, and I think does that harken back a little bit to the Oxford group roots? Because the Oxford group, yes, they were striving for contact, for living, first century post Christ church manner is what my understanding of it is, and having that contact. What are your thoughts on that?
I would say absolutely. I mean, their whole movement basically gave us a majority of the steps. According to Wilson, I believe he said something like, step 2 to 12 essentially came. But I think that it's like we're talking about earlier, the whole idea of the first step, it's like an initiation to really go through that door. Like, that camel won't fit through that eye. You really got to leave the old life behind, and the kind of suffering that happens for an addict is very different than it is in just a standard religious devotional fellowship or community. To come in broken in that way, it's just a whole different thing. And I think it's meant everything for us in the fellowships that people are coming in as actual addicts. In my days, I've been around a lot of stuff. I've seen people who have tried to work with the 12 steps without some real clear defining thing that they were really powerless over. And it, by all means, it makes, better people. But there's something completely different about coming to a point where, like, I cannot stop myself from doing this thing. I'm desperate. I need help. And the kind of help that you receive coming through that tends to be one that keeps your life going a day at a time.
So tell me a little bit about what personal benefits you see on a regular basis, if not daily, for exercising your step 11 by making that conscious contact with God. And I love this phrase, this part of the phrase here, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. I mean, so often in prayer, in my history of life have been more like, help me this, help me that, help me this. And in this step, we're talking about only asking for what His will is and the power to carry that out. So tell me about that a little bit.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too, earlier today before this podcast. Just these are the things that, and we talked about it already, that an addict, I would say the thing that the addict doesn't have is the power to carry it out. I mean, forever you're saying to yourself, if only I could stop doing this, or if I'll stop doing that. It's almost like an egotistical New Year's resolution or something. I'm going to do this, and you see the thing that you lack is actual power. And there's references to it. You're powerless in the beginning. I guess the word power makes it into the steps 3 times. The first is you're powerless, the power greater than yourself, which is the reflex to that powerlessness. But now it's the power to carry it out. And I would say that this idea that getting the power to carry it out doesn't come until now, because otherwise you would be, if you had the power to carry out what you wanted, man, life would be a mess. I've seen people with inherit money, and if you don't know how to use that properly, you can make one hell of a mess with a lot of money. You can really do yourself and a lot of people harm. I think of it in those terms.
Man, this is such as I look at it, I'm like, why didn't I see this 6 or 7 years ago when I was first coming through this awakening in my own life, my own powerlessness? But I never made the connection for the power to carry it out juxtaposed against my own powerlessness over my addiction, whatever that is, or my own powerlessness of doing something of value in life without really messing it up. That's such a powerful juxtaposition to see and have it click in my mind. Really cool. Thank you for helping facilitate that.
Yeah, to finally get to the place where your whole life is a concern of, what does God want me to do? What does He want me to be? It only makes sense at that point that that's the place to introduce power. If it precedes that, you can really make a hell of a mess.
Yeah, and it's the power to carry that out, and that is His will. It's not my will.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Very, very cool. All right, so first of all, how do you learn what God's will is for you in your life? How is that made manifest to you in your own praying, in your own exercising of step 11?
I've over the years developed a whole different relationship to this subject. I think in the beginning it seemed like God's will, this idea of His will was something that was, like C.S. Lewis calls, like tapioca in the sky, just this thing that, and everything that happened, oh, well, it must be God's will. And my relationship to it now is much more juvenile, I would say. It's like, I think essentially there are basic virtues in which we live by. And when it comes to things about what we are to do, now the Big Book gives a whole description of this, like, relating to your life. It says there's certain prayers that are, or suggestions on how to relate to your day and your life. Your day is a microcosm of your life. Pray for that any troubles that arise, that God will help you, and particularly to protect you from self-will. There's a whole series of things there. But essentially, this is, again, it's a kind of a simple view, but the way I see it is there are basic virtues you practice and live by. The Oxford group had the 4 absolutes, which AA adopted in the beginning and had At a certain point, Wilson said that he built them into the sixth and seventh step. But basically, those are very root, basic, fundamental, moral, ethical virtues. And you try to live by them regularly. They're the mother of the steps. I mean, this idea that they're, AA threw them out and they're no value or something. They're the mother of the steps. They gave birth to the steps themselves. They were the original program that the original people had. They didn't have the 12 steps when they wrote the big book. They were written as part of the book,
Right.
So these first 100 people recovered off those virtues. Those are literally attributes of God himself. I think you try to live by them, know what they are, know where you fall short, ask God to help you to live by them and make a decision as best you're able to carry them out in your daily affairs. When it comes to things where you're really, supposedly, you're kind of scratching your head and what's God's will? Do I turn right? Do I turn left? For the most part, I kind of have this simple view that you make the best common sense decision you can. And if you're wrong, which you very well may be, God will make it clear to you and give you the opportunity to make it right. And it doesn't have to be a major skull cracker to deal with the third step in this way, knowledge of God's will for you. I just don't think so. I think our bigger problem is the power to carry it out.
Yeah.
Because how many things do I know today that I should be doing or should have done and I didn't? I think it's the second part that's the bigger problem. And we sit around scratching our heads about, I want to know what God's will is or whatever. I don't think that one's the trouble.
So that whole concept that you just alluded to there, doing the things that we know or believe we know, is kind of the wellspring of this whole project for me. A few years ago, I had the awakening, I guess, that if I know something and if I don't do anything about it, it doesn't do me or anybody else any good. So I need to act on that and make something happen, because then it has the potential to do me and others around me some good. And there's so many things like you just mentioned. How many times in my life have I went, oh, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to just put that on the bookshelf here and never look at it again. What a waste.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to the power to carry it out, the part of the problem is that the power, we have these, vampires, if you will, that are just sucking the strength out of us. There's the word virtue itself means strength. Where Christ is there. Dr. Bob used to like this quote, but Christ is there and he says, I felt virtue depart from me when a woman touched his garment. It's strength. I feel strength depart from me. And I think that's what we're up against, are all these things that are sucking our blood, as you will, in the strength department. Do I spend too much time on my stupid iPhone? Am I eating things that I shouldn't be eating? Are my sleeping habits right? I mean, when you're dealing with conscious contact, you're also dealing with the body. You're dealing with your mind. You're dealing with your heart, and those things are constantly. You're up against compromising those faculties based on ways that we're abusing them. There's ways you abuse your body by your diet, your sleep habits. If you want to go into prayer time, this is, I think, why a lot of people have a hard time with prayer time in the beginning. Actually sitting down and doing it is because, my God, they've been invaded with all kinds of negative thoughts for years on end without any breaks on them. All kinds of things they've been putting into their body, chemicals and of all kinds of crazy foods and habits and stuff. And then you go to sit down and you're jumping out of your skin, you're out of your mind. I think the idea of actually seeking prayer, meditation, conscious contact, these things, it requires us to take a broader look at ourselves, our own bodies. What kinds do you let into your mind? What kind of thoughts are you letting in? What kind of emotions are you allowing yourself to indulge in? All these things have an effect on us.
I think this next question that just came to mind may be one of those I'm jumping the fence and cheating on this, I'm a thief here. But I think a lot of people who will listen to this series and these podcasts will hear this and be like, you know what? I'm not ready to go through all those first 10 steps here. I'm not ready to do an inventory or confession or turn my life and my will over to God. But I really want to get involved in this prayer and meditation and jump in here. But like you mentioned, like I've experienced and like so many people experience, we sit down and we try and quiet ourselves and we're just jumping out of our skins. Mm-hmm. How do you quiet your own mind and spirit and heart as you get into prayer and meditation routines?
I think if you look at the steps, it's kind of amazing that every time there is some form of some prescription for prayer, it always preceded, there's inventory. Mm. The 6th and 7th step. I mean, the 6th step is a prayer. It comes after an inventory. The 10th step, inventory. There's this thing that the actual scriptures is watch and pray. The reason that you are to watch is that you know what to pray for. But I think that, and I found this for myself, like this is one of the reasons why I find myself out of the necessary act of the 11th step, is that I start to get full of myself. I start to lose sight of where I need help. And when I return to inventory, it allows me to be able to pray in a way that I couldn't without it.
So often when I hear that phrase, watch and pray, I've often in the past thought, all I'm doing is keeping an eye out for, when that's uttered, Jesus is telling his disciples, hey, watch and pray while I go off here in the garden. Okay, I'm going to watch, make sure nobody comes in and bugs you. But I don't think that's what that means. It's stay alert to what is actually happening in your own life so that you can then know what to pray about. Like what you said, it's awesome. That's very enlightening. Well, good. So what else, is there anything else about step 11 that you feel is important to share with me and with those who will listen to this?
Yeah, I should have, and I missed it earlier, but I should say something on the practical part of it. Like I would say, for myself, it's become a regular thing that I do every day, that there's some actual aids to it that I found really helpful. Again, these weren't my ideas. These are just part of, working with a lot of people who took the 11 steps seriously and learning from them. Mm-hmm. But literally to have a place in your house, a table, maybe some artwork that is of value to you, a chair, a comfortable chair, that this is where you're going to literally seek conscious contact with God. There are, I think, especially for the newcomer, it's important to have a set of prayers, like this idea that you're going to go in and just talk or something. Now, I know this is my view. It's not everybody's view. Some, again, there's this idea of being quiet and listening. That would have been very difficult for me as a person who had abused my mind the way I did on fantasy and sexual thoughts and other thoughts of resentment and all this other stuff. For me to sit down, it would have been a very difficult task in a way. I literally need something like to read the Psalms and to read the steps. The steps are a very good thing to use as prayer and meditation. You can literally read the step and what does this mean? What is this asking? And then actually pray for it. Mm. But to have something like that concrete to do is important. I've developed something like, it's an 11-step binder. I've got a whole series of prayers. My wife actually helped put it together for me, but it's a whole series of prayers that mean a lot to me. And it's something that I have as a binder. I got all the prayers are printed out and they're inside their sleeves, and I flip through it and I go in order. And that's my own personal set of prayers that I use in my own 11-step time.
Huh. And you've got that binder set up on this table that you may have set up in a special place. So you just kind of...
Right over here.
go through it every day as you do your. That's really cool, and it's just something that you and your wife have learned over through experience. Hey, this is something that works for me, and this is how I'm going to do it, huh?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch. There was a whole bunch of people in my home group. They would do the same thing.
Hmm.
They pulled all their, favorite prayers together, and I've got them actually pictures of them on my phone. So if I'm away or if there's, I can access them and go through them.
Super cool. I like that procedural way of uh, facilitating that conscious contact with God. I like that. So, how in your life now do you work your, and we're going to jump on this, do you work
Mm-hmm.
step 12, which is giving back basically? How do you go about doing that now so that this whole process doesn't get stuck right here in your head and it's actually shared with others?
I have to go not in the weeds altogether, but there's this account I feel like I got to tell you about. There was he was not part of any denomination at all, but there's a Hindu who had been converted to Christianity. His name was Sadhu Sundar Singh. And there's this account, I have to, please forgive me, but there's this account that makes me think of this thing of the 11th step and the 12th step.
Okay.
He was in the Himalayan mountains. There's an account of it, a book about him.
Okay.
And he was with a guide, and they're walking together, and the snowstorm starts to happen. The snow is falling, and as they're walking along, they're in dire need to get back to the village, or they're going to die if they don't. And along the way, Sadhu Sundar Singh looks over the edge of the cliff, and he sees a man lying down on an edge.
Mm-hmm.
And he says to the guide, "Look, I think I see him moving." And the guide said, "Well, it doesn't matter, because if we don't get back, we're all going to die." And he said, "Look, as long as there's life in him, we've got to help him." And the guide said, "You help him, but I'm going to live, and I'm going." So the guide takes off. Sundar Singh goes down, gets the man, puts him over his shoulder as a blanket, puts him over both of them, and they start walking. And the snow is coming down, and the storm is accumulating snow, and it's just awful. And right at the crest of the morning, the sun starts to break out, and he sees in front of him the village. He finally makes it to the town.
Mm-hmm.
And right on the edge of the town is the guide, frozen dead. And it is like he realized that it was literally the exertion and the heat that was produced off of helping this man that kept them both alive. It's not your own. You don't produce your own heat. It doesn't come from yourself. It is made in the process of helping others. And that's the very thing that allowed him to live. And I think, my God, isn't that the 12th step? It's exactly what it is. And the heat itself is the conscious contact part. It's this thing you get from God, and you can't get from any other source. And you come in most close contact with it when there's people in need. And you can be some kind of not the source, of course not, but some kind of a vessel for it, Personally, how do I do it? As my phone is available, I've got a whole bunch of sponsees. I'm very active in literature work and websites and all kinds of stuff, just like Bill is, I'm just really active with all those kinds of things. And also I see the 12th step as not assigned solely to just because I'm in a fellowship with addicts of all kinds. I don't see it just assigned to an alcoholic or something. To me, it's my family members. It's those I work with. It's the lady at the counter when I'm getting rung up. The idea of carrying this message to others is I think it means in all my affairs and to all people.
How does working these steps, including step 12 that you just talked about, how does that bring peace into your life, where possibly, like you mentioned, you're coming out of your own skin before and just a mess?
Yeah, again, I think that ultimately the thing that I was looking for all along was union with God. The thing that conscious contact does is it produces joy. And joy doesn't happen in haphazard. There are things you have to do that produce it. Now, it comes sometimes, you have different experiences that seem almost accidental or something where God breaks through and gives it to you.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, our culture, our life, the thing that we're involved in here is not manufacturing joy wholesale. This is something that it is found in work. It's found in responsibility. It's found in facing the truth. It's found in actually caring about other people. I think that's the thing I was looking for all along, is that joy. You don't ever think, that you're going to get it by telling somebody all of your lies. You don't think you're going to get it by sitting on a chair for, 25 minutes every morning or something. You're not seeing that until it actually happens to you.
There will be people listening to this who are on the fence, either in denial about their own weakness in their own life, their own addictions, whether it be a spouse of somebody who is debating on what to do next because their loved one is a mess, of a parent of a child going through these difficult things. What advice would you give that person who's listening as far as getting into a recovery meeting or getting help anywhere? How would you guide somebody in that situation?
I guess what I would say is that I would say to go to God where you're at. And I think that that's a thing that is a lot of times people intellectually are barred from that action because they think that they have to clean themselves up first or they have to prepare themselves for it. Go to God, go to the program where you're at now. Don't worry about anything that would postpone that. When you look at the program itself, I mean, this whole thing came in because somebody cried out for help to God, and the answer that person got was greater than for themselves. It spilled out into all these fellowships and millions of people, and it's there. I think the first place you usually come in contact with it is when you meet someone who is like you and is now sane and has joy and has meaning in their life. And I think the first thing a person should do is, any kind of thing that's barring them from making contact with a person like that, just to persevere through. And that's essentially it.
I love what you said there. Connecting with somebody who was in the same or very similar predicament that you now find yourself in, who now has joy and some fulfillment and healing in their lives. And I think that so often, and I've experienced this myself, and I see it in so many other people, we're afraid to walk through those doors for the first time. What if somebody I know sees me? They're going to judge me, but that is honestly about the only place I'm ever going to find somebody who walks my same footsteps, who is wanting to change and is actually doing something about it. It's powerful.
It's a culture. A culture is an environment where weak things can grow in no other place. I happen to be a farmer, so I'm around things like we make our own apple cider vinegar, and you get something like yogurt. There's a culture. There's a living thing that's in there. It's alive, and the environment has to be just right. And if you don't put yourself into that environment, you'll never get in contact with what is alive. You need that. It's essential. That's the only place you're going to thrive, and you gotta be willing to make those sacrifices to go through the door.
And it's totally worth it, right?
Absolutely, it's worth it.
Because if you don't get culture in yogurt, you just get glop.
Yeah. Well, it's like C.S. Lewis makes this reference. It's like an egg. It has two possibilities. It either will hatch or go rotten. And that's essentially what we're up against. It's inescapable. You have to go forward. Either you lose your old life or you lose the one you got now. You know?
Awesome. Matt, this has been really good. I really appreciate you taking the time out to talk about these important things that I think will help. Well, it's helping me, and if nobody else, that's good. But I think it'll help a lot of other people.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Well, there you have it, Matt D. Thank you so much, Matt, for sharing your experience, strength, and hope on Step 11. We're getting close to the end of this series and getting close to the beginning of 2023, where we will kick off the year back with the live meetings on Fridays at noon Central Time. And the podcast is released Friday afternoons within about an hour of the live meeting going on. So if you want to join us live, do so. If you like listening on podcast, do so. If you like sharing it with your friends, do so. But most of all, remember that there is one that has all power. That one is God. May you find him now. Keep coming back. Let's trudge this road of happy destiny together.